Historians have been wrong about Rome's fall for centuries. Everyone thinks they know why Rome fell. Barbarians at the gates, corrupt emperors, lazy citizens, too much wine, not enough discipline. It's a neat, comforting story that fits into a textbook paragraph and lets everyone feel smarter for repeating it. But the real collapse of the Roman Empire wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a slow, quiet unraveling that happened inside people's homes, inside contracts, inside broken promises, and inside a system that stopped rewarding honesty and started rewarding survival. This is not a story about invaders. This is a story about how a civilization slowly hollowed itself out from the inside. At its peak, the Roman Empire looked like the ultimate success story. Roads stitched together continents like veins carrying economic blood. Stone cities rose from dusty provinces, complete with baths, theaters, aqueducts, and markets stacked with olive oil, grain, wine, and imported luxuries. Coins stamped with the emperor's face circulated across thousands of miles, creating the illusion of unity, order, and unstoppable momentum. From Britain's cold rain to Egypt's burning sun, Rome appeared eternal, permanent, and immovable. From the outside, everything looked stable. Legions marched in synchronized discipline, bureaucrats kept records, taxes flowed into imperial treasuries, and governors enforced Roman law with confident authority. Merchants trusted Roman contracts, farmers trusted Roman protection, citizens trusted Roman currency. That trust was the invisible glue holding everything together. And like every viral property drama you've ever watched, the moment trust starts cracking, everything else follows. Rome didn't collapse because people suddenly stopped believing in the empire. It collapsed because the system quietly stopped working for the people who depended on it most. Ordinary citizens, small landowners, shopkeepers, soldiers, and local officials slowly realized the rules no longer protected them. The empire still looked powerful on paper, but in daily life it became unpredictable, expensive, unfair, and exhausting to survive inside. The early warning signs were subtle. Inflation crept into the economy as emperors quietly reduced the silver content in coins to pay for armies and public spending. Prices rose faster than wages. A loaf of bread cost more each year, while taxes stayed aggressive and inflexible. Farmers began struggling to meet both production quotas and tax demands. Some abandoned their land entirely. Others fell into debt that never stopped growing. Large landowners saw opportunity where small farmers saw disaster. Wealthy elites purchased struggling farms at bargain prices and expanded massive estates worked by tenant laborers who were technically free but economically trapped. These tenants could not leave the land because they owed debts, taxes, or legal obligations tied to their location. The countryside slowly transformed from independent farmers into semi-locked labor systems that reduced mobility, innovation, and personal investment in productivity. In cities, artisans and traders felt similar pressure. Guilds once offered stability and protection, but increasingly became tools for the state to control production and taxation. If you were born into a trade, you stayed there for life. Your children inherited the same obligation whether they wanted it or not. Flexibility disappeared. Economic creativity slowed. People stopped dreaming of growth and started focusing on survival. The Roman government responded to instability the way many overstressed systems do, with more rules, more enforcement, more bureaucracy, and higher penalties. Taxes increased. Property assessments became harsher. Officials squeezed provinces harder to meet imperial quotas. Corruption quietly expanded because underpaid administrators discovered shortcuts and bribes were more profitable than honesty. Soldiers were no longer primarily defending borders. They were increasingly enforcing tax collections, suppressing local unrest, and managing internal instability. The army became less of a shield and more of a pressure tool inside the empire itself. Meanwhile, political leadership grew increasingly unstable. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Many were installed by military support rather than legitimacy or competence. Short reigns encouraged short-term thinking. Leaders prioritized immediate loyalty payments to soldiers over long-term infrastructure, economic reform, or civic stability. It became a revolving door of rulers focused on staying alive rather than governing effectively. Every new emperor promised restoration, strength, and prosperity. Every reign quietly left the system slightly weaker than before. On the surface, Rome still hosted grand festivals, magnificent buildings, and ceremonial pageantry. The elite continued living lavishly inside marble villas. Senators debated policy in decorated halls. The empire performed confidence beautifully, but beneath that polished surface, ordinary people felt squeezed from all sides. Taxes felt relentless. Opportunities felt limited. Justice felt inconsistent. Mobility felt impossible. Trust slowly evaporated. When people stop believing that the system protects them, they stop investing emotionally, financially, and socially in its future. They comply because they must, not because they want to. They cut corners, they hide income, they avoid risk. They disengage from civic responsibility. The invisible social contract fractures long before any visible collapse occurs. The Roman Empire began to resemble a massive property management nightmare. The central authority demanded rent, maintenance, loyalty, and obedience, but increasingly failed to provide safety, fairness, or opportunity in return. Provinces became frustrated tenants, trapped inside a rigid contract they could not renegotiate or escape. Some regions adapted better than others. Wealthier provinces absorbed the pressure longer. Strategic trade hubs remained profitable, but marginal regions began hollowing out. Roads deteriorated. Local administrations weakened. Recruitment slowed. Skilled workers migrated when possible or withdrew into subsistence lifestyles when they couldn't leave. Instead of reforming the system to rebuild trust and productivity, imperial leadership doubled down on control. Laws multiplied. Penalties intensified. Surveillance expanded. People were locked into professions, locations, and obligations. The empire became rigid precisely when flexibility was most needed. This rigidity made Rome extremely vulnerable to shocks. A drought could trigger food shortages. A disease outbreak could decimate labor pools. A military defeat could destabilize border confidence. Each disruption amplified existing weaknesses instead of being absorbed by a resilient system. The empire didn't feel like a shared project anymore. It felt like an extraction machine. Citizens didn't ask whether Rome would last forever. They asked how to survive next winter, how to pay next tax cycle, how to avoid falling into irreversible debt, how to keep their children fed and legally protected. When survival becomes the main goal, loyalty becomes optional. This is the environment Rome carried into the later centuries. Not a dramatic collapse, but a long burnout phase where the system slowly consumed its own foundation. The cracks were already there. The question was not whether Rome would face pressure. The question was how it would respond when the pressure finally pushed back. And that pressure was coming. By the time most people realized something was wrong with Roman money, the damage had already been done. Coins still carried the emperor's face. Markets still accepted them. Taxes were still demanded in fixed amounts. On paper, nothing had changed. In real life, everything had. The Roman economy depended on trust in currency. A silver denarius wasn't just metal. It represented confidence that the state would honor its value tomorrow the same way it did today. As long as people believed the coin held stable worth, trade flowed smoothly, wages made sense, and savings felt safe. Once that trust began to erode, the entire system quietly started malfunctioning. The problem began when imperial expenses exploded. Armies had to be paid. Borders had to be defended. Palaces, public games, bureaucracies, and political loyalty all required constant funding. Instead of raising taxes aggressively enough to cover these costs, emperors chose an easier path. They diluted the currency. Silver coins slowly contained less silver and more base metal. The coin looked the same, weighed roughly the same, and passed through markets without much resistance at first. But merchants noticed. Money changers noticed. Soldiers noticed. Prices adjusted upward to compensate for weaker metal content. Inflation crept in like a leak no one wanted to admit existed. At first, the increases felt manageable. Bread cost slightly more. Rent nudged upward. Transport fees rose quietly. But wages rarely kept pace. Contracts locked people into outdated rates while market prices sprinted ahead. The working population felt constantly behind, always catching up, never getting ahead. People responded the way people always do when currency becomes unreliable. They hoarded older, higher quality coins. They demanded payment in goods instead of money. They avoided long-term contracts. They raised prices defensively. Trust evaporated in small daily transactions long before any official acknowledgement occurred. The government tried to fight inflation using control instead of reform. Price caps were imposed on goods and services, wage limits were enforced, penalties punished anyone who charged too much or refused official currency. In theory, this was supposed to stabilize markets. In reality, it created shortages, black markets, bribery, and widespread non-compliance. If you couldn't legally sell your grain at a price that covered your costs, you simply stopped selling it openly. You sold privately. You traded directly. You hid production. Official markets became hollow shells while underground economies thrived quietly beneath them. Taxes made everything worse. The state demanded fixed quantities regardless of real market conditions. If your harvest failed or inflation surged, your tax burden did not adjust. Many farmers were forced to sell land, livestock, or equipment just to meet tax obligations. Some fled their property entirely, abandoning farms that once fed cities and armies. Large estates absorbed these abandoned lands. Wealth consolidated further into fewer hands. The rural economy became increasingly dominated by massive landowners who could manipulate systems, negotiate exemptions, and absorb losses that smaller producers could not survive. Urban life felt the pressure as well. Artisans struggled to acquire raw materials at controlled prices. Shopkeepers faced penalties if they violated pricing rules, but bankruptcy if they followed them. Skilled labor became undervalued and overregulated. Innovation slowed because risk became dangerous. Savings became meaningless. A lifetime of stored coins could lose purchasing power within years. Retirement security vanished. People learned not to trust the future. They spent immediately, bartered aggressively, or hid wealth in land, jewelry, or foreign currency when possible. Even soldiers, the backbone of imperial power, were affected. Pay increases lagged behind inflation. Bonuses were promised but often delayed or diluted. Loyalty became transactional and fragile. Military support increasingly depended on short-term incentives rather than long-term commitment to the state. As confidence in money collapsed, so did confidence in contracts, laws, and institutions tied to that money. If currency couldn't be trusted, everything built on it felt unstable. Business planning shrank to weeks instead of years. Infrastructure investment slowed, public maintenance suffered. Roads decayed, storage facilities deteriorated. Supply chains weakened. The empire responded with even tighter controls. Professions became hereditary obligations. People were legally bound to their trades to ensure production continuity. Bakers had to bake, farmers had to farm, tax collectors had to collect, movement was restricted. Flexibility vanished entirely. The economy became less like a marketplace and more like a forced maintenance system struggling to keep lights on in a collapsing building. Productivity didn't grow, it barely survived. Ironically, the wealthiest elites often insulated themselves from the worst effects. They owned land, controlled labor, accessed foreign trade networks, and leveraged political connections to avoid enforcement. The burden fell hardest on small producers and middle classes, the very people who traditionally stabilize economies and local governance. Resentment grew quietly. People stopped viewing the empire as a partner in prosperity and started seeing it as a predatory landlord extracting rent from a collapsing property. This erosion of trust did more than damage wallets. It reshaped psychology. People became short-term thinkers. Long-term planning felt pointless. Civic responsibility declined. Corruption normalized because survival demanded bending rules. When everyone breaks the rules to survive, rules lose meaning. Once money stopped working properly, Rome's internal cohesion weakened dramatically. Trade slowed. Tax collection became harsher. Enforcement became more aggressive. Social tension rose. Local loyalty faded. The empire still functioned, but like a building running on emergency generators instead of a stable power grid. Every new crisis strained already fragile systems, and then came the demographic pressures. Population decline from disease, war, and declining birth rates reduced labor pools. Fewer workers supported the same tax burden. Productivity slipped further. Military recruitment struggled. Rural abandonment accelerated. The economy entered a feedback loop of contraction. Less trust led to less investment, which led to lower productivity, which increased pressure on remaining producers, which further reduced trust. Rome wasn't running out of gold and silver alone. It was running out of confidence. And confidence, once broken, is brutally difficult to rebuild. By the time later emperors attempted reforms, the damage had spread too widely and too deeply. Systems hardened instead of healing. Compliance replaced cooperation. Fear replaced ambition. The collapse wasn't loud, it was slow and suffocating. And while money was failing quietly inside the empire, pressure was also rising along the borders, where loyalty and manpower were becoming harder to maintain.